Hello, good afternoon, everybody. How's it going? Hope everybody has had a great day today. Please feel free to get up and stretch. I'm not going to be offended if you get up and move around a little bit. My name is Pauline, and I'm here to sort of talk a little bit about some thoughts on portable jobs for open source content production. I'm from the ThinkBox Deadline team at AWS. Just a quick check, is anybody in the wrong exam room? Hope not. Alrighty. Here's my sort of agenda for the day. I'm just going to go through some introductions, what I think the problem is, why we think it's important to solve, what good might look like, and really just wanting to start a dialogue and get some feedback going. I've left a little bit of time at the end. Ooh. If my voice sounds shaky, I literally got a high heart rate alert while I'm sitting down a little bit nervous. Hello. So what I mean by feedback, please keep in mind as I speak, what is missing? Is there anything that's not good? And what matters most to you? And of course, I mean like any sort of feedback, right? All right. So once again, my name is Pauline Ko. So previously, I've worked at Animal Logic, MPC London, Technicolor, a little imaging startup called Lytro, a larger startup called Google, and now I'm at AWS. I'm here representing our ThinkBox Deadline engineering team. So what's the problem? In 2 words, we think it is unnecessary complexity. So on the left here, you'll see a list of workflows that kind of have a rendering component, and there's more every day. On the right, you will see a list of what we think are commonalities across the pipelines for these workflows, so including the workflows themselves, the software, dependencies, the way they parallelize, and also some of the file formats. These jobs have more in common than not, we think. So what are we really talking about? I think there's a better place to be where there is an open and expressive job description standard. It should be able to standardize the pipeline handling of job types and workflows for all of these different use cases. With me so far? Hope so? Right. So we want to simplify this sort of thing. If you prefer dark mode, I'm very sorry, but going for a chalkboard feel. You can sort of see this diagram really describes multiple solutions with custom integrations, and artists may be using different things for different pipeline tools for different solutions, and sort of having to cross-train and move around. You can sort of see this from another angle as having completely different pipelines for different applications within the same studio as well. We want to get to someplace more like this, or I think we could do better. So I think like if there becomes more of a standard around how our solutions can talk with each other and potentially have pipeline teams be able to develop their tools once and work with all these standards, I think it would be a pretty good place to be, at least simpler. But we need to strike a good balance. Expressiveness really matters here, and I think everybody understands that oversimplification is kind of a one-size-fits-none trap, right? So really, I'm here to hear from all of you on what that balance might look like. Why do I think it's important to solve this problem? Aside from collecting a paycheck, many of us have observed that farms and job pipelines are very often tightly integrated. You'll see that there's 2 circles representing each of the integrations from each of these tools towards the same interface. But does it need to be this way? This is a very common pattern that we've seen. It's kind of like, why rewrite the wheel? I think interoperability has been a theme across today. And I think that this kind of gets us closer to where that would be a reality between pipelines and farms. So here you see the diagram has been modified to have a standard write tool and then also a read and translation layer, which allows for a little bit more interchange. Eventually, though, we think that we could be in a place where pipelines, submitters, scripts, can be, again, just written once, and then work with really any farm or solution or tool that kind of just supports the standard. So that's kind of the goal. That's kind of why I think this is important. Still with me? All right, cool. Nobody seems to have fallen asleep. I'm doing well today. All right, so what might good look like? So we think good looks like this, that it should be human readable and writable, that it should be tooling parsable, it should be expressive enough, and it should contain data for the whole life cycle of the job. It should also be, of course, open and extensible. That's sort of why I'm talking to you all, as opposed to another group. But let me explain further. So what I mean by human readable and writable is really being about TD friendly, right? So humans with a text editor, everybody works that way in studios, and even beyond studios. So you should be able to examine this and pretty much have an understanding of what the reproducible behavior should be on the farm and on the host. It should be easy to inspect, easy to pull apart, easy to A/B test. Ooh, sorry, that high heart rate getting to me. Too much coffee today. Okay. Then, of course, it should be parsable by tooling, right? So we think that it's pretty important that pipelines can work with this, that graphical tools can be built on top of this for folks who are more comfortable with ClickOps. And so it's probably going to look something like YAML or JSON or just anything with structured syntax. And we also think that job specification is data, sorry, not code. If you want clarification on that, ask me later. Now to being expressive enough. So I think it should describe the work and how to break it down, and the instructions for pre-processing, and also the references to all of the data that it needs. It should also describe how to parallelize the work, obviously, the conditions before each job and task can be started, and parameters to iterate over. This can be things like frame ranges or stereo camera eyes, things like that. Which brings us to the job lifecycle. So how much data do we actually need to include? We think that there are 4 major phases of the job through definition, submission, execution in progress, archival, and deletion. And we've seen that pipelines use very different data about each of these jobs at different phases. So I would say that a standard like this should include all of the data for each of these phases, just to give a little bit of a target. And then also, once again, it should be open and extensible. So yet another format, right? So, but it should be an open format that everyone can contribute to, a common build specification to build towards, and really can or should bundle or work with other projects to sort of reference things that this standard might not want to hold on to. Aspirationally, we think that this could lead to better pipelines and testing, especially for open source content production, especially for production workflows with a lot of interchange between vendors and studios and different vendors and studios altogether, and yeah, just different solutions. And then for the end users as well, I think it'll have an easier on-ramp, right? You learn the standard, it's a skill set, it's pretty portable itself, and eventually maybe you'll have off-the-shelf DPL assets that you can pull down and just get rendering, right? And it should behave similarly across all the different solutions, making things easy to compare. So once again, I'm looking for feedback about this set of maybe good things to include in a spec that solves for portable jobs in open source content production pipelines. That's the end of my talk. I tried to go really fast so I wouldn't stand in between yourselves and drinks.
Any questions?
I don't know, man. Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Oh.
I'm just wondering what you think maybe the next steps are. I think it's a really interesting topic to discuss. And I think probably most, or certainly at our studio, we've been thinking a bit about how do we abstract away what the farm schedule is from how we define the jobs. But it sort of feels like maybe a working group.
Yeah, potentially. A working group is a great option. I think it's really about, like, first of all, is there interest, right? I'm glad none of you laughed me out of the room or it was, like, completely quiet in here. Everybody seemed to be nodding, which is great, well, from my perspective over here. So, I think that's great. I think we should just continue the conversation, right? So definitely come to drinks, and we'll talk about it. But also contact us here as well, or your lovely Academy Software Foundation folks. And like, I don't think this needs to be an AWS-driven thing, right? So to your point, a working group is a great option, but I think we just need to talk about it together. Yeah, and just what, I think for myself, the key thing is what level of expressiveness is good, because I think that's the start of like abstracting properly without leaving any workflows behind, maybe. But that's just me, I don't know. Great question, thank you. Nobody wants to get up and stretch? Yeah? Impromptu dance break? Whoop, whoop. Sorry, go ahead.
How's it going? I'm curious what your thoughts are, or if you have thought about kind of the scheduling and prioritization part of the farm, and is that something you're imagining as part of this description? You know, you kind of edged on it a little bit in terms of some of the things you'd hope to express in terms of like parameters and parallelization, stuff like that. I guess that's where I'm curious of what you think about that, because to me that seems like the part where it starts to get really potentially studio and production specific and a little bit hairy, you know?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. The way I think about prioritization is it's a little bit about the capabilities that are present and available at any particular time. And so it is a great marker of the intended priority to include some sort of priority value or something like that in a job specification. But ultimately, every farm or every HPC sort of infrastructure will need to make its own bin packing decisions of what can go next. And so I think like potentially something could be included in this standard, right, where you specify a value for priority, and then the farm would have to interpret that in a way that is somewhat standard. Otherwise, it might behave completely differently on one farm versus the next. But also, this could be the work of the translation layer that could implement some of the standard of aligning towards, like, you know, even what is your index, and does your priority become more important as the value increases or more important as the value decreases? Even that is like something that we might need to talk about, right? So, great question, thank you. Really? No spontaneous dance party? I did ask for a disco ball, but, you know, yes,
no,
please.
Thank you for the presentation, very good. Just a really quick question for you. I was curious as to what percentage of users do you see are actually using a render farm for more than just rendering frames, and then how do you see that basically kind of affecting different workflows kind of going forward? So say, for example, like, you know, there's a lot of people doing a bunch of submitting jobs to make USD files, for example, on the farm, and so that kind of leads into the whole open source and open standards thing. So it'd be great to get your thoughts on that, really.
Fantastic. Another great question. I feel like I didn't do a good job of putting you all to sleep so that the questions would be easier. But I think to address it directly, it's really about the elasticity of the farm. And I say that because I notice in particular that infrastructure deployments that are fixed tend to have a lot more weird bin packing patterns going on. And I feel like, this is just me, that it stems from folks having made an investment and wanting to leverage that investment the most. So if you have a fixed farm, it tends to be, great, why is it idle, right? Like, let's make use of every single CPU minute that's on there. Whereas I feel like for folks with more elastic deployments, right, where you can scale up and scale down, there's much less anxiety of like, hey, let's just put anything that can run on a CPU like on the farm, and it becomes more like you have specific deployments that work best and are tuned and optimized for specific workflows, and you might have multiple deployments that work in a very similar way but are really dedicated for a particular purpose. Let me just check in with you. Did I answer your question, or did I just waffle on a bit? I'm known to do that.
No, yeah, I understand where you're coming from in what you're saying, but I was just kind of curious as to say, regardless of how many cores you have, because you can scale up and scale down, but do you think that the purpose of a traditional farm, basically in this industry, is changing compared to basically a couple of years ago? And then how would you see kind of like the changes that you're, proposing, impact other workflows that would not be done traditionally on a farm?
Yeah, I think that's really important. So. The way I would prefer to think about this standard is that it just describes high-performance compute jobs, right? And so it doesn't really matter which particular industry or purpose, because a lot of these workflows are very common. And also there's so much emergent workflows and cool ways to make images that I think that this standard needs to accommodate a little bit of future-proofing. I think to your point about have things really changed from a few years ago, I would say that there's a lot more interchange, there's a lot more interoperability, mostly at the asset level, right? Because we see a lot of interchange standards in terms of assets, starting all the way with the illustrious OpenEXR, and now with all of the amazing interest around OpenUSD. What describes the jobs, though, the workloads, the things that you might need to trade back and forth because you're two vendors on the same show and the client has asked you to work together. I still think that that is an opportunity for us to standardize a little bit. But yeah, I hope that answers your question. Great, thank you.
Any other?
Hi. So a lot of the sort of VFX applications have got node graphs, and a lot of the technologies like USD use references to files that get loaded later. And so you sort of only know what you need after you've evaluated the top-level file or a top-level node graph.
I'm sorry, can you speak up a little bit? Like the monitor.
It's probably my thick South African accent that gets in the way of things as well. A lot of VFX applications have got node graphs where you sort of have still
No, sorry, not you. Like the AV folks just fixed it. That was great.
Okay.
Thank you.
So a lot of visual effects applications have got node graphs where you sort of don't know what you need from upstream nodes until you've sort of looked at a downstream node and sort of walked your way up the graph. Similarly, something like USD might have referenced files that you need to pull in, and you don't want to load those unless you really need them, and you'd only load them if you do need to load them in an application. And that sort of makes it hard, I think, in a sort of a job specification. We say, here's my YAML, these are all the files I need, and off you go to your job. So is that something you'll be looking at as part of these sort of standards or that you're trying to suss?
I think you found the hard problem here. Great work. Yes, absolutely. So the thing a few slides back where I was talking a little bit about reproducible behavior on farm and host, you're talking about a mode where the node graphs could potentially bifurcate and have conditional execution depending on one thing or another. This is, I think, an area that requires deep discussion because we could do that, but it tends to be more difficult, from what I've seen, for humans to evaluate that on the fly. And I remember back on my wrangling days, 3 a.m. shift, trying to figure out what's going on with the render. You want I feel, for this standard to be easily human parsable in terms of what's going on. So maybe there's a format that then gets collapsed into what will actually happen. Or if it's truly on the fly doing conditional things, we might want to think about, is that something for the standard or is that something for the pipeline? And maybe you evaluate that first, bake it out, and then perform the job. But great question. I am honestly uncertain. I kind of see both sides of it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Lots of questions. I like it.
I know. What's going on? Guys. I mean, I'm fine. Yeah, professional.
Just as was previously mentioned, like every company likes to slice and dice up their farm in all these different ways, and then target the particular slice that is best suited for their job. So do you see that in standardizing the content of a job, you also need to standardize the way you slice and dice up your farm? Is that part of this or not?
That is a very interesting question. You know, I don't actually know. I suspect that farm deployments and farm usage patterns will by necessity change if we standardize. But I don't know what that future looks like, except that it should be easier to compare. It should be easier to find what you're looking for. It should be easier to optimize, and it should be easier to inspect. So in terms of like, will standardization drive more specialization? It could, but I don't really know. Also, am I answering the correct question? Okay, great. I mean, may I ask what your opinion is, or is there a fear or anything like that?
Well, if there is something that's expressive enough, as you mentioned, that it would be great to be able to have a standard way, but it just needs to be wide-ranging enough to take care of all possible, workflows.
Yeah, I agree.
But it takes a lot of effort, but it's a nice ideal to strive for.
I think that's the extensibility, right, as well, of just making sure that we don't leave a use case behind, kind of, right? So really, what is needed for every particular one of the workflows I presented earlier is also changing a little bit over time. So sometimes they begin to standardize, and sometimes they leverage existing standardization, but just like have a variation, have like one more software tool that is different as part of their pipeline. So I think as jobs standardize, it will naturally hook into that ecosystem and maybe drive a little bit more collaboration. And I think that is ultimately the goal. So, yeah, fantastic question, thank you.
Any others? Oh.
I'll throw in a point for discussion, and I don't want to just be a man with a hammer here, but I feel like there's a lot of similar lessons to be learned in the world of CI job descriptions. I feel like we're all software developers. Most of us have probably interacted with one or more or many CI systems, and in many ways they do the same thing, right? About trying to allow anyone to do anything in sort of an orchestrated, dependency managed sort of system. And on one side, it's unfortunate there's no standard already in that space. Hopefully that's not like a black spot for this kind of effort, but I do think that there's also a lot of really good work that's been done there and lessons that we could learn around how to make these systems, like something like this, properly extensible and properly useful in like a really wide range of aspects. So yeah, just a thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're touching on two elements there, right? One is, I mean, if you're familiar with XKCD, number 927, I believe is the one here of like, there's 14 standards. Let's create one to unite them all. There's 15 standards now, right? Like, so that's one element certainly. And another is like, I really want to express that I am not arrogant enough in this particular realm to be like, haha, yeah, we know what's going on. Like, that's not the case. I think it's like bringing it to everybody here is really about listening and making sure that we are thinking about all the edge cases and also all the patterns, not just for folks who are building amazing imagery, but also for folks who are building amazing immersive experiences and the folks who are building the tools to power those amazing experiences, and all the way down. Not necessarily being that this is how you build software, but I totally agree with you. There are so many great patterns to pull from that realm as well.
Any others? Going once, going twice. Sold to Pauline.
Yeah!